Through Canada, and there was a lady standing on the side of the road waving frantically, and a man laying and stretched out on the highway. And I thought, oh, something's bad here. And I stopped, and as I did, he jumped off the ground. They came into the bus. The seats were removed, and they were just waiting for the next bus to go to the next town, and they didn't want to miss it. So that's why they were flagging me. And it could have been the same guy, maybe, I don't know, but. Yeah, it's been a while. I gave them the ride in there, and they seemed grateful for it, but they didn't care for the fact that there was not many seats in the bus. That was their first question: is where's all the seats? So they got a front seat. That's all that was left. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. We've heard that verse for how many years of our life, in or out of church. I think, it's so well known. John 3:16, you go to a football game and right there under the goalpost, someone's holding up John 3:16, and we know it. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And you wonder, God so loved the world that He gave His own, and that world, that encompasses an awful lot, but it comes right down to, for God so loved you and I, you or I, that He gave His only begotten Son. No substitute. And in all of heaven, there wasn't an individual, a created being, that wouldn't have been that substitute, that would have said, send me. This isn't right. I'll go. But for, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. His Son, no substitute. How often in life, would we want a substitute? How about when we have an ugly, I tell you, these things are great for reading, but they're horrible when you have to switch back and forth, and I'd rather look at you than my notes. And not only that, my notes are so horrible, they're handwritten, and I can't read what it is anyway, so I'm struggling here. But how many times have you ever had an ugly task that you thought, I'd like someone to stand in for this? Someone's thrown up on the couch. In between, you don't want to take care of that. Just give me a substitute. The septic system is overflowed. Man, my dad used to always, we had a miserable, when I was a kid, we had a miserable septic system, it seemed like, and it was my job that anytime anything happened, I would have had a substitute. Just give me a substitute. How many times in our life have we ever wished that, and the joke goes, if I could, clone me, we'll do that, just to get past this kind of an event that. Or how about when we think we're going to do something and we're going to look silly, locked out of our house in the middle of winter. A few years ago, my mother lived next door to us. We had built her an apartment, and our house sound doesn't carry real well, and she couldn't get back in the house, the door locked behind her, and she was in her nightie. She'd gone out to get the newspaper, and then she was banging on our door trying to get us to wake up, and we couldn't hear her, and it's cold out. It was, I don't remember how cold it was, but like 40 below as I recall. It was cold out, and then she starts eyeing the neighbors, and, but she doesn't want to go over there because how silly she would look, Just send in my substitute for those things. Let him go over and take care of this. But we don't find that substitute in Exodus chapter 12, and you can turn there. I'm going to read this. So in Exodus chapter 12, we're familiar with this story. In Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 28, it reads like this. And I'm reading, I think, the King James Version here this morning. And it says, Exodus chapter 12. Let me find Exodus if I can learn to spell this thing. Exodus chapter 12. And then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said unto them, Draw out and take a lamb according to your families, and kill the Passover. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two side posts that the blood that is in the basin, and none of you shall go out at the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and upon the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. And you shall observe this thing for an observance to thee and to thy sons forever. And it shall come to pass, when ye be come into the land which the Lord will give you, according as he has promised, that ye shall keep this service. And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, What mean ye by this service? That ye shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the house of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our house. And the people bowed the head and worshipped. And the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. So, here's another one of those things. The plagues, we're familiar with the plagues as Moses had come into the land of Egypt, and he says, okay, we're going to, let my people go. And the king says, no, we're not doing this. And so he says, okay, there's going to be plagues. And so there was fleas and flies and frogs. And the Israelites recognized these plagues, but then, because they were all affected by it, but then at some point they weren't affected. So here they're told, do this. Sprinkle the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. And this is going to be, not with some modern paintbrush, but take a branch and splash it on there with that. So it's not really necessarily clean. And so here we go with this, am I going to look silly? Nothing has happened to us lately, and if I do this, this house has been in our family for almost 400 years. I don't need another job. I don't need some cleanup in the morning. Maybe if I just, I wouldn't mind a Caribbean look here. I'll go with a pastel yellow with red on the door frame and the windows, and this will look good. And so I'll start with the red on the door frame, and we'll go from there. And I'll do it when the neighbors aren't looking. And I don't want to be embarrassed. I wouldn't want that. And so I'll do it my way. I'll substitute a stand-in. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Another familiar text is the 23rd Psalm. How does that go? And there's a part right there at the beginning. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. When I was, I'm going to go back to what, kind of chewing my cabbage twice here, something I've told you before, but the idea of yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I had a bit of that experience when I was younger. I ended up spending the summer in the hospital. And there was some question about whether I would not just recover, even if I would live. And yet, as time went on, it became apparent that I would. And I was grateful for that. But in that event in my life, I knew that there was an opportunity, there was a chance that I was going to die. And the doctor had called for the priest and, said to give last rites, and I didn't feel that I was there yet, but I had a hope, because there was one light. And that's the thing about this that I want to point out, is that, that yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, you can't have a shadow without a light. And that light is Jesus. And I recognized that I needed a Savior in my life at that point. I knew I did. I knew how my life had been going and what I had done. And so on the recovery phase, they sent me off to Seattle, which was cool, because I was only like a couple states away from my grandparents, and my grandparents had been a big part in my life, and my grandfather used to come up and work summers, and when he did, he'd spend the summer with us, and he worked, and then he'd go back out in the fall time, and I got to know him quite well, and kindred spirits, he and I, we spoke the same language. We really appreciated each other, even though there was that huge age difference. And so when I was there in Seattle, and I'm thinking, I want to go see my grandparents. I'll never get this close for a long time, probably. And so I thought, I'll do it. I'll just go on down to California, a state and a half away, whatever it is, okay. And then the thought occurred to me that, what if something was to happen to them before I could get there, as I am this close? And so I prayed that God would preserve them and till I could accomplish that trip. And sure enough, He did. And that threat, real or imagined, it's real when you're thinking it. And so as I made it down to California, and there it was, late fall, early winter, we were standing there, and they had an old weathered barn out back of their house. And in this barn, there was a stairway that when I was 4 years old, we'd been visiting, and my grandfather had built that stairway, and I was there as a distraction at that time. And so when we went into the house, he told everyone that I built the stairway. He told it so convincingly that I believed it. I thought maybe I had built that stairway. And so, I was always proud of that stairway. And then, here I was standing outside this barn, this old weathered barn, and out back of the barn was a walnut orchard. When he came up and worked summers here, Grandma had stayed behind and planted an orchard of walnuts. And they'd harvest them in the fall time, and when they did, there's always some left behind. And my grandfather would go out and glean those. And he had stretched out between the house, the well house, and that barn was corrugated tin on the ground, and all of these walnuts were on that tin, and then he covered them with glass, all kinds of glass, the panes, like the front off of a service station. They used to have these big windows in the front of them. He had somehow come up with some of those, and then other windows and such laid out there on top of it, so that the sun would strike that and warm up underneath, and would dry those, so acoustically drying those walnuts. And he's standing on one side in his bib overalls with his carpenter pencil in his pocket and some paper, and he always had in his pocket, whenever he went to a restaurant, he didn't want to waste the napkin and leave it behind because he may not have used it totally up. So in his pocket he carried a napkin, that just in case he needed to ungrease his hands or whatever. And he's standing over on that side of the walnuts, and that corrugated metal and glass and the walnuts separating us, and I standing there in my blue jeans and a shirt, thinking it's kind of nice this time of the year here in Northern California, no snow. And as we're talking, he said, "Bobby, I'm sorry for what happened to you." I shrugged it off, and I said, "Yeah, I know, it's no big deal. It's okay." And he says, "I'm really sorry I didn't send you a card in the hospital." And I said, you did better than that. He drew these cartoon figures, and he had sent me a page of these cartoon figures with the balloons with the words in them, and I said, that was better than any Hallmark card you could have sent. Then I have it, and I framed it, and I have it on the wall. I don't know what happened to the cards that were sent. I may have some of those still somewhere, but I have that. I know where that is. And he said, Bobby, I would have rather died than that happened to you. And I about jumped over that glass and the walnuts and the corrugated tin so I could slap my hand over his mouth before those words reached God's ear. Didn't want that to happen. I was so thankful there was no substitute. We can endure a lot. But we need family and we need friends. And God has given these to us. We support one another. We come here on a Sabbath. And we think, we sit here and we hear the message, and what's it going to do for us? And truly, there's a message. But there's a message unspoken by just showing up and being here, by supporting one another, being interested in one another, talking to one another. For God so loved the world. That wasn't that he created and he left us alone, that he ignored us from then on. God so loved the world that he's involved. He's paying attention to us. He wants to hear from us. He wants to talk to us. There's no substitute. And he says, I've gone to prepare a place for you. I've gone to prepare a place for you that where you are, or where I am, there you'll be also. Pretty cool. It's not a state and a half, 3 states away. It's not that far. It's a short journey. God's coming to take us home. There's no substitute for Jesus. There's no substitute for you and I. There's no person that can take your place at that table that Jesus is preparing, that banquet table. There is no one. He expects, he wants, he desires to see you and I personally there. There's no reason not to be there, folks. He's chosen you. He wants us to be home together. So as we look at our life, as we think about what we do, we have an effect on one another, but we have a destination. We have a Lord who is the light, who calls, who wants us to be home with him. So, learn daily. Talk to your best friend. Desire to be with him. Don't hesitate to travel that short distance to see him. Our closing hymn, I chose it and I don't know it.